What is next when it comes to making maps of Dark Heritage? I had previously stated in my last map making video that I was unsure if I was going to go on to the next step and make another map or not. I'm now feeling more and more certain that I probably will, for a couple reasons. For one, it was always my plan to make a final, very polished map with digitally added labels, because I feel like my calligraphy is mediocre at best and is never quite as good as what I would like. So that's one reason. I was always going to do it anyway, and it will look better. Another reason is that as I've looked at the map and as I've had it completed now, there's a few things that I don't think were done quite right. And that's part of the reason why I wanted to do another round of a draft so that I could have a final version that I was more happy with, rather than feel like I'm kind of stuck in a draft. And you do get to a point where you don't want to keep tinkering forever. I don't want to George Lucas this up and quote unquote release it and then years later say, oh, I want to just tinker with it. I want to get it to a point where it's kind of done. I don't like going through multiple drafts, but I do kind of feel like one more draft would kind of fix some of the issues. Some of them are just cosmetic. Like I experimented with some new styles. I experimented with a new way of drawing maps with some new tools that I hadn't used. This is literally the first time I used it. So I should have anticipated that because I was experimenting, there would be things that I would later turn around and say, that didn't turn out quite as well as I'd like, and I want to do it better. But also just some of the actual geography, it didn't work. And some, as I went from one draft to another, I kind of expect to get it all fixed, if you will, and just I'll like the result a little better. So I probably will redo it. Now I want to address a couple things. Somebody asked me on a comment to my last map making video, and I thought it was an interesting question. I had mentioned that the desert was kind of like the Colorado Plateau Southwestern Desert. And I had also mentioned kind of vaguely that in terms of scope and scale, it was kind of meant to, and I deliberately didn't put a scale on the map because I wanted to be able to flex it, but I did kind of imagine that it was kind of like California and Nevada, and then maybe, a bit further east from there. I did not mean to imply that in any other way other than scope and scale that it was like California, Nevada, eastern Wyoming, Utah, and Arizona or whatever. Didn't mean to imply that at all. I just meant in terms of kind of the size. Although that's not exactly true either. And maybe I should take a step back. And I haven't really talked about this setting very much here on my YouTube channel. And I don't intend to kind of delve into the details of it here either. But maybe I could just do a little bit of high level meta talk about how did I get to where I am with this setting. And this is a setting that I've been working on and off again for a number of years. And it's gone through several different revisions, major revisions over the years. And I'm currently on revision 5, and they always think that the latest revision is going to be the last one, and then for various reasons it ends up not being. So I don't know how long revision 5 will last before I decide I want to do something different with it, but probably quite a while yet. I think that I will be on revision 5 for many more years before I kind of want to tear it all up and redo it in a different model. But let me kind of just start back a few revisions. And I've always been tinkering with homebrewing. I've always loved homebrewing. In fact, partly because of the age that when I came into D&D, homebrewing and running the game were largely synonymous. I kind of came in before the advent of campaign settings as we know them. And it's not entirely true that they didn't exist, but they didn't exist in the highly detailed version that we kind of know now. The Forgotten Realms box set hadn't even been released yet when I started doing this, and even if it was, I didn't see it for some time. Greyhawk was kind of developed, but I'm not even sure that there was a good, easy to get a hold of gazetteer that kind of said, here's all the elements of the setting and where they are. So homebrewing and running the game were, like I said, really kind of synonymous. So I've always homebrewed, and I enjoy doing it for its own sake. I enjoy map making. I enjoy world building for its own sake. And so, although I kind of have this main setting that I've been working on for a while, I'm always tinkering with things on the side too. And a lot of times those end up getting grafted in or otherwise kind of built into my setting. And in fact, there was a time kind of late in the third edition of D&D life cycle where I recognized that I was using common elements often enough that I actually wanted to make them modular setting elements and deliberately kind of make them disconnected to some degree from any particular setting, but they could be dropped into any other setting, assuming you could find a place for them and, kind of find ways to anchor them in the setting around the edges and stuff like that. So that's where a lot of the elements that this map has actually originally started as modular setting elements. And I was doing this, like I said, late in the third edition life cycle. And as the fourth edition was being announced and as it launched and, et cetera. And I never played fourth edition. I didn't buy any of the books until much later. And even then I only kind of bought, some of the fluff books to look through. And mostly I didn't buy those. Mostly I just either found them at the library or borrowed them from some friends and kind of flipped through them, read through them. But there were some elements that kind of came out and was like, yeah, that's a good idea. I don't know what 4E is going to do with it, but I kind of want to take that same concept and do my own thing with it. One of them was the idea that there was a empire of the tieflings long ago that had since kind of fallen on hard times and been destroyed. The way that I envisioned it, it kind of remained as disconnected city-states separated by savages who had largely been the slaves of the tieflings and were now, these kind of pseudo-nomadic, horse clans type people, and they were heavily influenced by some of the Plains Indians, by the Huns, by the the Mongols, the Scythians, stuff like that. Various steppe and prairie peoples of the real world. But they had kind of, in my setting, they had been the former slaves of this Tiefling Empire, and the Tiefling Empire no longer existed. Although some of the city-states that had formerly belonged to it still did, and some of them even still had Tiefling aristocracies at least. So that was one element that I developed, and I developed it, based on nothing at all other than a one-sentence high concept of what Baal Turath was supposed to be in 4th edition. And that's all I knew about Baal Turath. It was it's this old Tiefling empire that had fallen on hard times and no longer existed, and there are still Tieflings around, but they didn't have their own state anymore. And based just on that concept, I went and developed that, and it became a modular setting element, and I kind of put a big salt sea in the middle of it that was kind of influenced by the geography of the prehistoric pluvial Lake Bonneville, which once covered the majority of the state of Utah during the Ice Age. And it was just this gigantic inland sea that gradually shrank to become what is the Great Salt Lake today. But it used to be much, much larger. And in fact, the terrain of most of the American West was very different back then. And this is all south of the glaciers, even during the Ice Age. So it's not like, you should imagine, snow and tundra and stuff like that. What you should imagine is today's Southwest, but if it had quite a bit more rain than it does today. So instead of deserts, you might have forests or, richer grasslands and savannas. Instead of giant dry basins, you would have large lakes like Lake Lahontan, Lake Bonneville, Lake Manly, Lake Mannix, which are all gone now. They're all dried up and have just tiny remnants left, if even that. And so that's kind of what I imagined. And on top of that, I said, well, if I'm going to do that, then why not have the same kind of Rancho La Brea fauna, which is very familiar in many ways to people who are familiar with the animal life of the American West, the wildlife of the American West. But it's kind of ramped up, and it has this, very dangerous safari kind of feel to it. You got buffalo that are 25% bigger than what we have now. You got wild horses that ran all over the place, kind of like zebras do in Africa. You had giant lions, you had saber-tooths, you had dire wolves, which were, although they call them dire wolves, they're really a totally different kind of dog-like animal. Probably more similar to hyenas in some ways in terms of how they structured their, how they fed. They had, stronger jaws and teeth, and probably were capable of, acting a little bit more like a hyena. So, et cetera, et cetera. They had, mammoths, you had mastodons, which kind of took the place of the elephants. And these weren't like the woolly guys. Like I said, don't imagine the snow and the tundra and the ice. It's not like that. It's still southern Rancho La Brea is still Southern California, right? It's smack dab in the middle of LA. And although the climate was milder and wetter than it is now, it wasn't, so radically different that you would, it wasn't frozen by any means. And it was still a mild, pleasant, Mediterranean-like climate, but just one that, had bigger lakes and bigger forests and greener prairies and, et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of what I imagined the backcountry, I guess, looked like. Not only for my Tiefling empire, and I changed the Tieflings, they became something else, but they're conceptually similar. And that's kind of what I imagined as the backcountry for that empire. Another project I did was loosely based on a Paizo element, and there's an adventure path that Paizo did called Carry On Crown. Is that the right one? Takes place in Ustalav, which is and Paizo is interesting. They have a setting, Galarion, right? And or Galarion, I don't know how they pronounce it, but it's really several settings in one, and different parts of the setting have a very different tone, and I think it's kind of meant more that you play a game, or at least a story arc, in one area that fits the tone. So there was an adventure path it did called the Carry On Crown, and it was set in Ustalav, which is kind of a horror area, and it's kind of based on Transylvania with some other horror elements kind of thrown in and made to fit. And I had, in my modular setting, had come up with something that also was, it wasn't actually based on that initially, but it was very similar in its inspiration. It was also based on a bunch of horror elements and gothic elements. It was actually based on, again, a one-sentence description of the book Open Grave, which came out for 4th edition. Before the book was even out, I kind of read this, it wasn't a sentence, it was a paragraph or two, and it said, it mentioned something about a kingdom run by vampires, and I said, well, I can come up with my own kingdom run by vampires. I don't need to wait for this book. And so I did, and that is what eventually became my Timishburg. So it was another modular element. I actually had a different name back then. But when I specifically adapted it with the idea that I could run a heavily modified and adapted Carry On Crown adventure path in there, I kind of took all those elements and kind of remixed the geography a little bit, did it a little different, and it became Timishburg. So both of these elements are parts of my setting now. They were developed not necessarily meaning to be next to each other or even to necessarily be in the same setting as each other, although they often have been as I've tinkered with stuff. But those are the two elements that make up kind of the western edge of my map. And up in the north is Baal Hamazi, which used to be Tiefling area, and there's some other stuff up there too, but the empire kind of all fell apart. It's now full of city-states who can only extend their influence and reach, within a relatively small area, and they're kind of separated by, vast seas of wilderness that are crawling with savages who are unfriendly to people from the city-states for the most part. So, it's kind of a, dangerous kind of wild frontier area with these city-states and then, deserts and weird kind of, leftover demon-haunted this or that. That's kind of the northern half. The southern half is the country that's ruled by vampires, although it's not entirely open. I think a lot of people understand that there's probably vampires, there's a lot of folklore, but they're kind of like conspiracy theories, and in fact they're correct, but it's also, and lots of people know about it, everybody's heard of it, just kind of everybody's heard about, conspiracy theories about JFK or whatever. But they've never really been proven, and a lot of people don't take them seriously or believe them even if they know it. So a lot of people don't really believe that there are vampires that rule Timishburg, but there are. And the setting is supposed to have very much a kind of gothic horror vibe, and that doesn't mean that it's anything at all like Ravenloft. It's really that's not a super great analog for it. I'm not sure exactly what. I think Ustalav is probably the best analog for it from Paizo. And that's really kind of what it is closest to. Although it's my own thing, but that's from a conceptual standpoint and how it was executed, that's probably the closest thing you can imagine. So that is half of my setting. The other half was again, it was a completely different setting that I had developed, and I'd struggled with exactly how to do it, and I'd finally kind of come up with this map. And it was, meant to be much more kind of classic adventure, medieval adventure stories, maybe even less fantastic in some ways than D&D per se. And it meant to have, specifically kind of English people, Robin Hood and Ivanhoe type people with, a lot of good old Anglo-Saxon names of places and characters and stuff, so it kind of had this very familiar feel. But it was also meant to kind of be on the frontier. So there was also kind of an element of, the American Old West. Not in the sense that you would ever find cowboys and Indians out there in this section of it, but more in the sense that kind of it has that kind of frontier feel. These kind of smaller frontier towns all over the place, people who had kind of recently become homesteaders in a new territory. And then there were also two big city-states here, although they did exert much more influence than Tiefling city-states, and they kind of were almost like two pseudo-nations, if you will, although, from a ethnic and cultural standpoint, the people of both nations were the same, but from a political standpoint, they were kind of two of them. And then most of the smaller settlements and whatnot throughout the area kind of had some type of vassalage or allegiance to either one or the other of the two of them. And that setting was a completely different setting. And what I'm setting right now is basically the three of those kind of just jammed together. And I had to rearrange the geography significantly from all of them to make them fit. But I ended up kind of wanting to use all of them, and I wanted to make them part of my setting. And the reason for that is because I wanted to have a place where all of the races in my setting could say, well, that's my homeland, or at least that's the most likely place that I came from, or my ancestors at least came from. And there are other places that I can kind of envision, although I've never really mapped them out. I've got some other names and I kind of know vaguely where they are, but I don't intend to feature them, and I don't intend to really ever show where they are, and I don't really intend to make much use of them, to be honest with you. But, I do kind of have this vague, larger continent kind of mapped out in my head with, other nations. But I decided that it was deliberately a good idea to not try to make my setting too big and not try to make it a whole freaking continent. And that's really too much adventuring possibility for anybody to use. And it just kind of dilutes what you're able to do, I think, if you create too big of an area. So I kind of have these other areas out there as just kind of, well, they're there, but I'm not going to focus on them. I'm not going to ever map them. Probably won't even mention them. I may occasionally, a character from one of those places pops up here and there. So anyway, that's kind of where my setting came from and where it is. It's not really a D&D setting anymore, even though I talked a lot about D&D. I actually use a different system now, although it's based on D&D, but it's a different system. It kind of has different races. I don't have like your elves, your dwarves, your hobbits, your halflings, gnomes. I have different races. I mentioned tieflings, and that's one of the ones I have, for example. So it's kind of a different type of setting, and it's meant specifically to be a more humanocentric setting. The other races that are not human are kind of like corrupted human bloodlines. It'd probably be the best way to describe them, like tieflings are, for example. I don't want to get into discussing too much what they all are, because that's not the purpose of this video. Maybe another one down the line. But I kind of wanted it to be a little bit low fantasy. I wanted it to have a little bit more Robin Hood and Ivanhoe, but with monsters here and there. I think in terms of what kinds of stories the setting would be about, I would imagine sort of like the fantasy equivalent of the X-Files or that Supernatural TV show with Jared Padalecki and Jensen Ackles, where they kind of run around hunting monsters, but most other people in the setting don't necessarily know if they believe in the existence of a lot of these monsters, but they do exist. And obviously the PCs, if you will, would be the characters who specifically deal with them. So they would have a lot more exposure to the supernatural than most people, whereas most people would be skeptical that half this stuff even exists at all, even though I imagine there's a lot of superstitious people, but still it's kind of like, nobody's ever seen a monster, or a few people have ever seen a monster. I mean, the frickin' wildlife is dangerous enough on its own without having to add monsters to the mix. So it's kind of got this low fantasy, dark fantasy. It's fantasy, but it's kind of a hybrid with horror in some instances, but also with swashbuckling action. I think maybe, although it's not a very good movie, I think the movie that has very close to the right tone is, well, Solomon Kane is one, the movie with James Purefoy, and I'm drawing a blank on the name of this movie. It's the one, Van Helsing. There we go. Van Helsing with Hugh Jackman. That would be, another one. Again, they're not great movies, but they are good examples of exactly the type of tone and feel that I'm going for in my setting, at least, if nothing else. So anyway, that's kind of where I'm going. Like I said, there's some things I want to change. I feel like as I kind of jammed these places together, some of them got a little bit shorter shrift. I feel like Timishburg and Baal Hamazi in particular got squished into too small of an area. And I either had to jam stuff too close together, or I had to cut stuff out that I didn't really want to cut out. Meanwhile, the hill country is kind of big and empty. As I went from my first to my second draft, I deliberately expanded those areas because I wanted to mix up the size of my elements. I felt like too many things were kind of too close to the same size. And so those kind of expanded, but maybe those weren't the areas that should have expanded because there's not a lot in them, quite honestly. In fact, I had to add some elements just because I felt like they were too empty, considering the amount of real estate that they took up on the map. So I do kind of want to redo the map. I want to resize and rearrange slightly how stuff fits together, so it doesn't feel quite as cramped and busy, and that there's room for everything that I actually want to make sure that I have on the map. And maybe that means that some of the stuff that I have does get cut, because maybe it isn't the best element to fit there, and it's less important than something that I don't have right now, or that I have in a manner that's a little bit too squished. Because I do have some areas that are really big. I got this big boneyard desert, and it's basically featureless. And I've got this gigantic prairie called the Golden Wolds, and it's mostly featureless. And I've got these big forests that are mostly featureless. And then on the edges of these, I have these areas where there's, tons of stuff all kind of stuffed into a small, narrow little area where it feels very cramped to me. So I think that the map does need another pass at, arranging it itself and just trying to make sure that it actually fits together the way I want it to. So that's one reason I want to do it. And then I thought, look, I always did want to kind of do one final level of polish in terms of style. So it makes sense to let's do both of those together, redraw the map one more time, and we'll go from there. Anyway, that's kind of what's next. Don't expect to see that in the next little bit. It'll probably be weeks before I actually start drawing. It could be a month or two, or maybe even a little bit more, who knows, before I actually scan it and have it ready to go and ready to present. But that's kind of what I'm going to work on next, and so that'll be kind of the next stage, probably the final stage of my map making project.